Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Midday with Trey, your weekly afternoon break. I'm your host, Trey. Let's get right into the show. Today's guest is a professor in the history department and comes onto the show today to talk about his book, The Grim Years, Settling South Carolina 1670 through 1720. Let's give it up for Dr. John Navin.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on to the show. How's it going today?
It's going very well. It's kind of quiet around here.
Oh, yeah.
I hope everybody's off having a great Thanksgiving.
Yep. So could you tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, just to start with?
Well, I'm a northern guy. I was born in Boston, raised in a suburb just outside of Boston, Watertown, one of those towns founded by Puritans back in 1630. I went to school around Boston. I went to University of Massachusetts in Boston, got my master's at Boston College, and then got my doctorate at Brandeis University, which is just about 7 miles outside of Boston.
Okay.
Moved up to Maine to live in the woods and work on my dissertation up there. And after teaching for a year at Brandeis, I came down, taught in Pfeiffer University up in North Carolina for a couple of years, and then was fortunate enough to land a position here in the Department of History at Coastal. That was back in 1999, long time ago.
Okay, and where'd your passion for history spawn from?
Well, when you think about places in history, if I asked you to make a list of the 3 or 5 most historical places in the country, I'm not sure what you would list, but I think a lot of people would say, well, one's got to be Boston.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Paul Revere, Boston Tea Party,
Right.
the Pilgrims, Lexington and Concord,
Mm-hmm.
Salem witch trials, lots of things. Every direction you turn in, there's a history site.
You're right.
And so I grew up in the middle of all that, so history was kind of all around, and I always had an interest in it. So even though I was an English major in school, I ended up with a degree in history, and I'm delighted to still be teaching it.
Okay, cool. And what are some things about the early South Carolina history that most people may not know about?
Well, I think that most people, when they think about or talk about early South Carolina, they think, oh, rice plantations and slaves,
Right.
and that's their starting point.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a bit of history before that. Rice wasn't even a viable crop in South Carolina for the first 25 years. And then it took another 25 years to really get plantations up and running. So people, are kind of advancing the history, advancing the timeline, if you will. The early South Carolina settlers were looking for a way to make money. They sold a lot of livestock or slaughtered livestock to Barbadian settlers because the sugar islands in the Caribbean, the land was so valuable, they devoted it to sugar cane and would purchase food from elsewhere, including South Carolina. The forest products, pitch and tar and turpentine and resin and so forth, and lumber was a way they made money. And unfortunately, another big moneymaker, and one that very few people really know much about, was the capture, the purchase, and sale of Native Americans. This grew out of the deerskin trade. When the settlers first came in 1670, a few monopolized the deerskin trade, and that was the big money maker to start with. Well, that trade with different tribes soon took an ugly twist, and that was, in addition to getting deerskins from some of these Native American groups who were business partners, if you will, settlers, not all settlers, but a handful of settlers realized that these same tribes could raid their rivals and capture their enemies and bring them to Charleston, and they could be shipped to Barbados to work in the sugar fields. So I think most people, well, very few people know about Barbados' history to start with, but
Right.
a lot of people know that many Africans were used in sugar fields in the Caribbean, and not a lot know that Native Americans were used in those same sugar fields and specifically Native Americans from South Carolina.
Hmm.
So at one point early in South Carolina's history, there were probably more Native Americans being exported to Barbados than there were Africans being imported.
Oh, wow.
And when the governor took the first census, unofficial census, in 1708, that showed that the number of enslaved Africans outnumbered the number of free whites. And then you add to that, I believe it was about 1,500 Native Americans who were enslaved. So the enslaved community considerably outnumbered the free white community, and that's 1708. And when you think about the fact that South Carolina was planted, or the Charleston settlement was planted in 1670,
Right.
that means it took just 38 years for them to have more slaves than freemen.
Right.
Kind of frightening. So many people aren't aware of that very dark part
Right.
of South Carolina's past. I think that there's some confusion about Barbados. Many people don't realize that Barbadians were the driving force behind the settlement at Charleston, and they maintained hegemony, which basically means they steered the boat, even though they became smaller and smaller in terms of percentage of the population.
Okay.
They didn't dominate the numbers, but they dominated in terms of political and economic power.
Right. Huh. Yeah. And so I think I already know the answer to this question, but where does the title of your book spawn from? I think, like I said, I think I know the answer to this, but why focus on those specific years for that time frame?
Well, so we needed another history of the early South Carolina years. One hadn't been done for about a century.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I mean, that period has been mentioned in different histories, but a history that focuses specifically on those first 50 years hadn't been done since John Fiske wrote his history. And so I was responding to that need, and I had been doing a lot of research on South Carolina extending all the way up through and beyond the Civil War. So this book was a product of some of that early research. The reason it's named The Grim Years is, if you read the book, you'll certainly come away with the understanding that this was just a terrible place in many ways.
Right.
Unless you were one of the elite, one of the rich guys who managed to have a monopoly on these very lucrative trades, most of the people in early South Carolina lived lives of misery. If you look at the Native Americans, certainly they were devastated by disease, by the Indian slave trade, by warfare. If you look at the plight of Africans who came here, I don't think I need to explain to you how rough their lives were.
Right.
Although their lives actually were going to get rougher over time, because in the beginning, when they were being used to tend cattle and hogs and to work in the forest with the lumber products, that probably was not as brutal as the regime, the labor regime on a rice plantation. Imagine going into one of these swamps and trying to clear it, cut down the trees, clear them out, and prepare that to be a rice field.
Right.
So in terms of disease environment, in terms of labor environment, in terms of the numbers of slaves, things got worse, not better over time.
Right.
And then the settlers themselves, if you weren't one of the prosperous elite, that means you were probably a poor farmer. You were pushed into the hinterlands by the people who were seizing the land for rice plantations, and you were probably living a very marginal existence, kind of a hardscrabble life.
Okay. So between writing papers, teaching classes, and everything that I'm sure you do, how do you have time to write this book?
Well, it's our job,
Yeah. Fair
right?
enough.
Publish or perish. No, every serious scholar here, everybody who's working here in a tenured or tenure track position has three basic responsibilities. Number one is teaching. Number two is scholarship, and number three is service. And scholarship is important, whether you're producing articles or books in a field like mine, like history, or whether you're doing broadcasts or creating works of art or creating music.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of wonderful work going on around here, and writing books is just one form. But that's something that not only am I expected to do, but it's also the joy of the career I've chosen.
Right.
I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I was just teaching, because the desire to research, to know more, and then to share that is something that I think I and all my colleagues have. That's one of the reasons that the Department of History is such an active place. You've got scholars where we may all be in the historical field, but we're in different periods, we have different interests, and we're sharing that with students and sharing that with the reading public through what we write and presentations like our Peace and Conflict series. And then, of course, there's public history, the fine work that Katie Clary and others have done with the museums.
Right.
And we just have a lot of people working hard with undergraduate research and trying to help people like you to the next step in their careers.
Right. That's great. That's great. And final question, what do you hope readers take away from the Grimm years after reading it?
Well, I think that it's important to understand where you came from, and in a sense, many people who read this book might say, well, that's got nothing to do with me. I was not a native South Carolinian, or I didn't have relatives here back then. But I think there's a human story here, and a story about relationships, and a story about priorities. And in this case, it's kind of a grim one. You asked me about that word grim. One thing I should point out is early in the book, I compare the work of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And Thomas Hobbes had a dark view of what was going to happen in a world where there wasn't one powerful central figure. The king had just been executed when he wrote this. John Locke we think of as a champion of liberty, in a sense, of theory, you know, the natural rights and so forth. And I contrast those things, and it's from the writings of John Locke where he talks about how dark things would get in a world that's unregulated, where everybody was in competition with everyone. And that, I think, is really a good description of the first 50 years of South Carolina.
Right.
It changes after that, but in the beginning, it was a winner takes all. It was a fist fight, and every man was out for himself. And there are a lot of victims.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I learned a lot in just our short conversation, so I appreciate it. And make sure everybody checks out the book, The Grimm Years.
Well, this one's for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Please read.
I will.
Okay.
I will. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.
Okay. Take care.
All right. It is that time again. It's time for this week's Hat of the Week. For this week's hat, oh yeah, we're rocking and I was told this is how you wear it. We're rocking I think this is maybe a bowler hat. I think it has some other names, but I think those are pretty offensive. So I think this is called a bowler hat for now. Let's just call it a Santa bowler hat. I know it's not Christmas time. I know it's hopefully, fingers crossed, if all goes well, this episode will be out the day before Thanksgiving, aka the day after tomorrow. So this will be out on Wednesday, hopefully, on time. But I know it's Thanksgiving, but I know this is, we're wrapping up the season. Next week we have a great episode. I won't spoil who the guest is yet for that, but just make sure you tune into next week's episode because we do have a great guest. But for this hat of the week, we have this nice Santa themed bowler hat provided by the dean's office, and I don't know, but I know I look fly. All right, so there's no events this week. But with tomorrow being Thanksgiving, I thought it would only be right if I share with you what my Thanksgiving plate would look like. Okay, so let's start like this. A good 3/4 of the plate is going to be taken up by macaroni and cheese. Let's just start with that. And then we'll get about 2 pieces of fried chicken. I'm not a big turkey fan. Like I rather have some type of other different assortments of meat. So I'm gonna have 2 pieces of fried chicken. I'm gonna have 1 leg and 1 wing. That's just lightweight. And then I'm gonna have a type of vegetarian meat, and this is where it gets interesting. And then we're gonna add the collard greens, you know what I'm saying? Gotta get the juices flowing around the whole plate so everything gets absorbed, you know, the flavor. And then we're gonna have a dinner roll right there. Yep, you're picturing it. I know you see it on screen, but you're picturing it in your head. And then finally, we're gonna for the drink, we're gonna have the Foxworth Punch. And I can't tell you the recipe because it's obviously a Foxworth. I'm Trey Foxworth. A family recipe, but just know that all that combined, food coma instantly. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this episode of Midday with Trey. We're wrapping up the season, guys. It's almost over. We have this episode, and then we have next week's episode, and that's it for the season. And then we'll start back again sometime next semester with new guests, new themes, and hopefully, you know, we'll do some updates. You know, you never know what we'll get here. But I thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure if you're not following our Instagram page, it's at Midday with Trey. That's it. We're posting behind-the-scenes clips, and you know, who knows what type of stuff. So really want you to follow that. You know, get some behind-the-scenes footage and all that good stuff. But for now, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys later. Make sure you guys tune in next week, same time, same place. Bye.